So hello there guys and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. I hope that you guys are well, and after an action-packed, scintillating Japanese Grand Prix, we are here to discuss another breakdown of the latest installment in the Formula 1 2022 World Championship, where Max Verstappen came out on top once again to get back to winning ways. However, he's going to have to wait a little bit longer in order to be confirmed the Formula 1 2022 World Champion. Oh, wait, hold on, sorry, I'm just been past something. Sorry, excuse me one second. Just been past something. Just a notification. Oh, wait a minute, hold on. So Max Verstappen actually is the 2022 World Champion. I mean, that's very, very odd, actually, because, I mean, judging by the rules of the race, for those of you that would have watched the Grand Prix, I thought, by my calculations, Max was actually 1 point short because he was awarded half points. But apparently, unbeknownst to myself, the F1 fan base at large, teams, pundits, drivers, even the stewards themselves by the sounds of it, and Crofty no less on commentary, you seem quite adamant that this was the case. Apparently, because the race resumed after a red flag rather than the normal circumstances, full points can be awarded rather than the half points or even 75% points that we were expecting. Therefore, that means I can confirm once and for all that Max Verstappen is the 2022 Formula 1 World Champion. Well, I mean, that says it all, guys. I mean, who would have thought the FIA could just change things on the fly like that, or just bring up some information on the regulations that nobody apparently knew about except for them? So quite convenient that they were able to do that, but thank goodness that they were, because quite frankly, Courtney, my guest on this show as always, it's quite interesting that nobody seems to know what the rules were except for the FIA, but thank goodness we have the FIA on standby to correct us and educate us when we needed it most. So, of course, first thing we have to say, congratulations to Max Verstappen on an otherwise well-deserved World Championship this season. Has been the class of the field, has been absolutely phenomenal, and of course, it all gets summed up with the dream victory in front of the Honda home crowd in Suzuka. First of all, now that we've got the confirmation from the FIA, so kind of them to do so at the last minute, what were your thoughts regarding Max Verstappen finally sealing what was his inevitable second World Drivers' Championship?
Yeah, I echo what you're saying about, he's driving. He's taken it to the next level this season, but God Almighty, some of the decisions by the FIA, and it spans from last season. Oh my God! Honestly, I'm at the point now where I'm almost lost for words, and that takes quite a lot. For those of you who know me well, I am almost lost for words for the state of the governing in the sport. And once again, Max has won a world championship with obviously he was bound to win it. But he's won a championship in that moment thanks to divine intervention from the powers that be. And one day Max will win a championship under circumstances. But yeah, congratulations to him. He has driven well this season.
Yeah, of course. For those of you who couldn't tell watching that, obviously I was being rather sarcastic. Of course, I knew that Max Verstappen was the Formula 1 2022 World Champion. And of course, we should, congratulate him. And you've made a good point, Courtney. It just seems that for whatever reason, whether it be the controversy in Abu Dhabi last season, which of course we're not going to get into again because that one has been done to death almost, and I think we can wait until we talk about the budget cap finalisation in the next episode of the podcast, because we're waiting for that one on Monday as well after that was unfortunately delayed. You may make of that however you want. But of course, what went down this weekend and all the drama and everything else, the one thing that we were kind of expecting was Max Verstappen to win a world championship in normal circumstances. And unfortunately for him, being the only constant that's done everything right up to this point, everything else around him seems to be an absolute shambles, to the point where we can't even get Crofty to do the proper announcement on Sky, because even he didn't know. We had a whole race going on, Courtney, where we were being told repeatedly by the broadcasters that, if the race ends as it will be, or if it's not able to complete the time limit, which it didn't, we would only get, 75% points because we just completed, I think it was 54 or 52% of the race distance that was actually completed. The checkered flag went out to see Max over the line. There was still 1 second left on the clock, so he should have gone round again because he actually finished the race too soon to actually let that be the last lap. So it was just a shambles all round. you just feel... I mean, obviously, you can feel for Max so much. I mean, he's world champion. I'm sure he'll be elated after a season of many triumphs for him and the Red Bull team. But just for once, for the poor lad, how many times has he got to win a world championship for it to be won under normal circumstances?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the amount of points that you've made there, and obviously this episode will be coming out on a day of the price cap outcome, and that's another shambles, which is just going to leave a slight moment of uncertainty for Max in the back of his mind. I'm sure. So yeah, one day you will win a championship. Normally, this episode will probably be heavily about the pair of us bashing the FIA, and for me, they are to blame for any kind of sort of unsettled moments for him and the Red Bull team in this very moment and for the next 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think I couldn't have summed it up any better, Courtney. This episode is literally going to be about us bashing the FIA, and we're obviously going to have to remind ourselves that we do have to talk about the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend, because the Japanese Grand Prix did happen despite the lengthy delay that the weather caused, and of course the red flag that happened in between, which caused even further delays. We were concerned we weren't even going to get much of a Japanese Grand Prix. We only had one full lap of running before that red flag came out. But of course, we should talk about the race itself. The start of the race, it was absolutely heavily hindered by the weather. We were worried that we were going to have a delayed start, but we got the race underway from the first lap. It was a good initial getaway from Charles Leclerc at this first phase of the start, I should say. Max Verstappen pulling a brilliant move around the outside in treacherous conditions, no less, to get around him. All of them starting on the intermediate tyres, and then immediately after that, when those two went by, that's where the chaos ensued, where we had Sebastian Vettel having a collision with Fernando Alonso. Vettel, you could see the onboard where Vettel couldn't see at all, somehow managed to survive and recover his race. But then, of course, the big moment happened with Carlos Sainz, absolutely aquaplaning early on in the lap, completely ruining his race, crashing out on the first lap, which he was absolutely devastated about, starting in P3. Lewis Hamilton nearly driving into the side of him without even seeing him. Luckily, he managed to avoid him. Pierre Gasly catching on one of the advertising boards, taking a whole new definition to these aero pieces going on these cars, finding downforce in so many different ways this season. It was crazy what we saw there. Alex Albon, of course, he had a failure with the car, which caused him to retire. Absolute chaos ensuing, which caused the red flag. I mean, one thing we can take away from that one, Courtney, is how impressive that overtake was from the new world champion Max Verstappen on Charles Leclerc after originally losing out the lead from the original getaway.
Yeah, he's shown a sort of a level of calm that we've seen in him more this season than we have in the past, which, obviously this season has been easier for him, but he seems a lot more composed when it comes to having duels with other drivers. But we all know how exceptional Max Verstappen is in the wet. So when I saw the conditions were wet, I thought that Max is going to be in a league of his own today. And from the very start of that moment, that certainly was the case. What should I say? From the beginning of the race, it was bang on it from the start. It was like, I've got a mission to complete. And he did. He literally looked like a man on a mission. And that's exactly what he did today.
Yeah, I mean, it's often stated that Max is a very, very good driver in the wet weather. And admittedly, I've been one of those fans that have looked at what he did in Brazil quite a few years ago when he put in that brilliant performance. I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2017 or 2016 or something like that. Yeah, where he put in a great performance in the wet. And I used to come back at that with the caveat that Max was on fresh, wet tyres when everyone else around him wasn't. So he made that performance look a bit easier, probably look a little bit easier than it actually was. But in fairness, I thought that, well, he had an advantage over everyone else, so it probably was a bit easier for him to pull off some of those moves, as impressive as it looked. So I wasn't really taken aback in sheer awe compared to some other fans. But I must admit, over the years, watching Max in difficult conditions, whether it's dry, whether it's wet, whether it's treacherous, whether it's, easy, he just always seems to find grip in certain places where no one would even dare to go. And perhaps myself and other fans as well probably should give Max Verstappen more credit where credit is due, in that he is up there with some of the best drivers on the grid and arguably some of the best drivers of all time in wet weather conditions.
Well, yeah, it's another example why I personally put him in the same bracket as the Schumachers, the Hamiltons, because the all-time greats will sort of showcase their ability in all conditions. You can have a look through Schumacher's career, Lewis Hamilton's career, obviously other greats like Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost. You look through and you can, even when they didn't have the best car, you can look through moments where they were able to display their sheer talent when naturally when it rains, it kind of closes the performance deficit. We've seen that with Max, particularly in his Toro Rosso days, in his early days at Red Bull, when they weren't able to match the pace of Mercedes. So he's even before he became world champion, he was already showing hallmarks of a guy that will go on to be a multiple world champion and a legend of the sport.
Yeah, and now he's officially done that. Although, despite the confusion and the lack of confirmation that we got during the race, we finally got that towards the end of it. And of course, we'll talk about that a little bit later on to add to the otherwise shambles of a performance from the FIA for some time now. It must be said, this is not a new thing, unfortunately. There's something, regarding Max Verstappen, of course, one thing that we probably wasn't going to mention in this episode before I just thought about it was qualifying the day before, where Max made that mistake coming out of 130R in difficult conditions, completely made a mistake which caused Lando Norris behind him to, take evasive action, and Max Verstappen avoided a penalty as a result of that. Now, the FIA's reasoning for that was they gave Max a reprimand for his driving. Lando wasn't on a fast lap. If he was on a fast lap, he would have been in that position. They were aware of where the cars were on the circuit. But, I've seen... There have been previous instances like that where a driver has been punished, not necessarily for impeding another driver, but for dangerous driving. Lewis Hamilton was penalised for this in Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago, where he made a similar mistake and he got a grid drop for it. So to hear that they use that rationale, where they said that we're using previous incidents as a sort of base or a foundation of where we compare this incident to others, and then to come up with not giving Max a grid penalty, I must admit that was a bit of a surprise like that. Sometimes, and perhaps this isn't, I don't want this to come across as me saying, Red Bull get away with everything. But of late, it just feels that sometimes certain drivers do seem to be treated differently in certain situations. Now, I'm not implying that Max Verstappen gets beneficial or preferential treatment from the FIA, but when you're trying to come up with a rationale to not penalise someone, it has to be spot on the money. But I've seen that a few incidents like that where drivers get penalised for so much less in qualifying than that. And it was another example where the FIA just completely went against what seemed to be the norm in certain circumstances like that, really. What did you make of that, Corny? Do you think it was right what the FIA did with Max Verstappen? Did you feel that a reprimand was a fair punishment?
No, I think this is one of many examples as to why the FIA are so flawed. And, going to go a bit deeper into this, it's been no secret over the past couple of seasons that F1 fan base in general has become a lot more polarised. It's become a lot more toxic. It's becoming more like the football community. And I do believe the main reason for it is the lack of transparency and the lack of consistency, and actually a lack of strength of leadership within the FIA to stand firm on decisions, no matter who they're going to upset. They just seem to change the rules as they go along. They seem to ad hoc as they go along. And you don't know where you stand as a fan. So if you're looking on and you're seeing, I'm going to give you an example now. And Bonotto made a quote about this, actually. We waited well over, an hour last week after Singapore to get a decision regarding Sergio Perez? Waited over an hour, nothing came of it. Today, we'll say on the day of recording, after the Grand Prix, it took 5-10 minutes for them to demote Charles Leclerc, and then all of a sudden they added on the extra points, and that made Max Verstappen become world champion. Now, I touched on this last season. I do believe that the Red Bull team, particularly Let me start again, Adam. Sorry.
It's all right, mate. It's a late one this evening. And just for the benefit of people listening to this podcast, we are recording this late on a Sunday night. That's admittedly my fault, because I not long just got home from a trip in Paris with the missus. So that's why we're recording this at this time. So, but yeah, Courtney, you're making a good point. I know where you're going with this, like with Dr. Helmut Marko. You were telling me about this earlier. Obviously, there's a feeling that sometimes with Red Bull or certain powers that be, you get teams, all the teams try to lobby their interests at the FIA, try to get this advantage, try to get that advantage. That's what Formula One is about. It's about playing the politics. Toto Wolff does it, Mattia Binotto does it, but any other team principals do it in other teams. Of course, some have a greater effect at it than others. It does feel sometimes that Red Bull do tend to be better at doing this than other teams. And the incident that you were referring to with Charles Leclerc outbraking himself, which admittedly I agreed was a penalty. I think he gained an advantage by staying ahead of Perez, and he tried to block him over the line. I think 5-second penalty, fair enough. In a weird way, it's kind of the ultimate. It kind of shows how this championship has gone for Charles Leclerc. That last mistake that he's made has really culminated in Max Verstappen becoming world champion this weekend. But ultimately, the FIA, rather than do what they did with Perez, wait to investigate this after the race, have a thorough investigation, invite the driver in for his side of the story, take into account the wet weather situation, despite the fact that they said they weren't going to do that and then did it anyway. Did none of that. They just gave a penalty straight away. And I said to you, Courtney, in the group chat, and again, I'm not bashing Red Bull here, but I said in the group chat to you, Charles, you can't be pulling that shit off, mate, because you're not driving a Red Bull. It does feel sometimes that when you get these situations happening, Red Bulls seem to benefit from the FIA more than anything else. And again, I know it might sound like to some of you Red Bull fans, I'm bashing Red Bull here. I'm not. I'm simply stating that when we get these contentious moments with the FIA getting involved, it does feel like Red Bull do tend to get the rub of the green more so than others. And maybe there's an element of truth in that where they actually are doing the right thing or they are following the rules correctly and Red Bull just happens to be benefiting from it. But some of these really strange decisions that they're making, I don't know. There just seems to be a lack of consistency going on from the FIA right now. And it's starting to rub me up the wrong way. So I can sympathise to a degree how some other fans may have felt for some time before this is going down. And this is coming from a guy who supported a team that benefited greatly from inconsistencies with the FIA or not. 2019, great example of the old engine fuel gate business and stuff like that. I mean, the list goes on, really. Something that we're used to as a Ferrari fan, for example. But yeah, this time, I don't know, it's not really sitting with me, this lack of consistency with the FIA and how they're administering these punishments and how they're judging similar situations from one week to the next.
And, follow on from your point, Adam, in the time of recording, we're still going to wait the outcome of the cost cap regulation decision. I know for a fact, regardless of the decision that comes out tomorrow, there's going to be bitterness. And again, that is just down to how poorly it's been treated from the FIA. Sometimes, fans do get carried away. Sometimes I get caught up in a moment because I just think, how on earth? I get so frustrated by the lack of consistency and the decisions that they make. I go, how on earth are they getting away with that? Or how are they coming to those kind of conclusions? And I know for a fact that I have no trust in the decision that the FIA are going to make regarding this. Because they could have got it dealt with swiftly, but no, they delayed it by another 5 days. That makes the decision look fishy. So again, it's as another example, it just seems that a sport that we're so passionate about has been gaining traction, gaining popularity, has been growing worldwide. And the people at the very top make the sport look like a joke. Like you're trying to make Formula One more accessible for more people. And you have people that like sort of casual sports fans aren't really into F1. They'll ask us questions about F1 and they go, what's going on in F1 at the moment? And we can't answer it because we don't know the rationale behind the decision making the people at the top make. Yeah. I just think moving forward, then they really need to have like a good look within themselves internally because right now it isn't good enough. And I just want to add something, Adam, before we finish. I've now joined you and Lee in the illness club. It was my turn this week. So if I'm coming across a little bit chesty and a little bit flummoxed, it is because I'm recovering from a stint of the lurgy, let's say.
Oh dear. It seems to be getting everybody at the moment, but I hope you feel better soon. And I just recovered from all of that stuff, so I'm feeling a lot better now. Although albeit a bit tired, but we persevere nonetheless. And it's a lot of good points, mate. Honestly, because we feel like we're repeating ourselves here, but what's been going on with this budget cap business, and I find really strange, and of course we're going to be talking about this in more detail in the next episode when hopefully we'll find out what the outcome is, if we find out that everybody's compliant or if there are any teams that aren't compliant. Not suggesting or naming names here. I know Red Bull has been a team that we've often mentioned. Aston Martin, we shouldn't forget, are another team that have rumoured to have been involved in these investigations, whether they've breached the budget cap or not. Of course, people's interpretations tend to differ depending on who you actually ask on this situation, but when you get, after all of this time of investigating and auditing and trying to figure out what the hell is going on, only to find out on the Wednesday before the Japanese Grand Prix, where we're meant to be talking about Max Verstappen potentially winning the Formula One World Championship for a second time, that after all that wait, when we're finally going to get answers, we have to wait a little bit longer. To me, I'm not going to imply from that someone has done some wrongdoing and they're trying to find a way to cover this up. But you get to a point as an F1 fan after everything else that's going on right now that even in a scenario where we may find that everybody has been compliant with a budget cap, who is honestly going to believe the FIA now? Quite frankly, I mean, let's be real. If this was any other team, if my team was involved in this, I'd be worried for Red Bull fans and Aston Martin fans, because and this is assuming that people are right on the money with these rumours that these are the two teams that involved. They might be wrong. I mean, it could be Alpine, it could be Ferrari, it could be Mercedes, it could be Haas, of all teams. I mean, can you imagine if it was Haas that breached the budget cap? I mean, and I know, but I digress on that one. Who knows? But in this case, I just feel like right now, if you're a fan of a certain team that's rumoured to be involved in this, I would be worried, because no matter what you do, you're going to be looked at as the villain in all of this, whether you've breached the budget cap or whether you haven't breached the budget cap. Nobody's going to believe what the FIA are doing right now. No one's going to trust them. It's very, very fishy. And quite frankly, if there were no breaches, why would we have a delay in this answer? Surely all the certificates of compliance that they kept banging on about would have been issued out and we'd be done with it. And guys, I think that's the last that we're going to talk about that until the next episode next week. Hopefully tomorrow, on Monday morning, when this episode is out, we will find out who has been compliant. We'll hope everybody's been compliant and we can move on from this. Of course, we probably won't accept it because the FIA are dodgy as they come. But at least we'll get an answer. Hopefully. And I really stress on the hopefully. Courtney, let's get back to the racing, because
let's go.
Before we start bashing the FIA again, I think people would probably appreciate that we get back to the racing. But one thing I did want to ask you about, and I think Jensen Button made a really good point on the commentary, and this is kind of the next phase of the next topic I want to talk about, it's regarding the wet tyres. What is the purpose of these wet tyres? Because we had some really extreme wet conditions today, and the team started the race on the intermediate tyres. They took the gamble. They thought, right, we're going to start on the intermediate tyres. The track was getting worse all the time, and it explained a lot of the aquaplaning issues, to the point where by the time the teams come to the grid ready to get going, the track was already too wet for the inter tyres. But the teams wanted to take a gamble, and Jensen made this point. He basically said the teams and drivers have been so obsessed with the inters as of recent, they literally started a race which was clearly full wet conditions on a tyre that was inadequate. So what does that say about the wet tyres? What is their purpose right now? It feels like the only time that wet weather tyres seem to be bolted onto an F1 car is when the stewards force the teams to put them on. The moment they get going, after a few laps if the track is drying, the inters come straight back on. Demonstrated why you don't keep the wet tyres on the track by Mick Schumacher, who led the Grand Prix for the first time in his career for a brief moment. He stayed out too long, and those ended up going to the back of the field once he put the inters on. So I'm a loss for words right now. What is the point of these wet tyres if we're going to end up on the conditions where they're suitable are so fine between the red flag coming out because the track is too wet, or the track is actually better for intermediate tyres and it's worth taking the gamble and risk perhaps aquaplaning off the circuit?
Well, I think it's almost as if the design of the wet tyre isn't fit for purpose for a safe race, because I understand the rationale behind the consequence, let's say, of wet tyres being a safety issue, because we saw today was a prime example of it. The design of the wet tyre is to have deeper grooves, which allows more surplus water to be released from the sides of the car. But we all know that becomes the rooster tails, that becomes spray. Particularly, it's more apparent in these ground effect cars in 2022. So now we have a situation that when the cars bolt on the wet tyres with these deeper grooves, because of the amount of surface water they release, it creates visibility problems. So there's going to be like this really fine margin between it being too wet to use inters, but the moment you put the wet tyres on, you can't race because it's no longer safe. So maybe we are heading for a situation where it's going to be inter tyres, and if it's too wet for inters, you red flag it or go behind the safety car. But then, even if you have safety car periods because of the rain, that creates issues because where they're not going at a speed which isn't fit for purpose for Formula One cars, the tyres get cold, and then that becomes a safety issue. So it seems like there's yet another thing that's going to have to be reassessed moving forwards. And if anything, that might be another cost saving measure by only having one type of wet tyre. Just putting the idea out there.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like when you have a lot of these sessions that get suspended because of the wet weather, now it just feels like F1 in the modern day, and I don't want this to come across as if like, oh, F1's being too soft here, or that the drivers are not subject to conditions in the same way that they were in years gone by, because they're not. And, you know, safety is paramount, and we should be making decisions in the best interest of safety. I mean, I remember what happened in Spa last year in qualifying, where they took a gamble. Lando Norris went out on track. Vettel said the track is too wet. They should have red flagged it. And as soon, literally within a minute, Lando Norris crashes at the top of Eau Rouge and Radion, and you've got Vettel on the radio basically checking he's okay, and then saying, what did I say? What did I say? It was too dangerous. Red flag it. So, you know, the conditions, obviously, you know, they're quite treacherous, and obviously we shouldn't be taking risks. But when we don't have tyres that are suitable for these conditions, like the wet tyres, this is the conditions that the extreme wets are meant to be suitable for. And if we get to a point where the threshold between where the window is for these wet tyres is so narrowly thin, you literally could take a piece of tread off the tyre to describe how thin this window is, what is the point of having them?
Mm-hmm.
Because literally within minutes, you're either going to go from a situation where someone has a crash and causes a red flag because it's too wet, or you're going to end up with a scenario where actually the tyres aren't really sufficient, they're getting too hot, we need to put the intermediate tyres on because they're better suited for the circuit. It's just ridiculous, quite frankly. So it's something that Pirelli needs to look into with the FIA. I'm not sure what the answer is right now. We need to just make a decision right now and just say, look, the intermediate tyres are there. If it gets too wet for the inters, then we stop the session, or create wet tyres that are actually fit for purpose for a performance perspective as well, because teams are going to take the risk. If the inter tyres are so much faster, which evidently they prove to be, demonstrated by Mick Schumacher, then obviously it's going to be better for teams to put the inters on rather than keep the wets on, quite frankly. So very, very strange stuff. We need to move on to the incident with Pierre Gasly. The big talking point from this weekend, minus the fact that Max Verstappen is the 2022 Formula One World Champion, of course. The incident with the recovery vehicle. Very, very scary moment. We saw Pierre Gasly, onboard footage of him, after taking a pit stop to have his front wing replaced, had to catch up the pack where the safety car was brought out onto the circuit. Pierre Gasly fizzes past, after the hairpin, fizzes past the recovery vehicle, pretty much hardly could see it at all with all the spray and everything else going on. Very difficult conditions at 250 kilometers an hour. Very dangerous thing. Caught him by surprise, and to the point where he was on the radio basically saying as much as that he couldn't effing see it, and it was extremely dangerous. He thought he could have killed himself. He was absolutely livid. Other drivers passed this recovery vehicle on the track during the safety car. We saw onboard footage of Sebastian Vettel, we saw Max Verstappen, we saw Perez, we saw Leclerc, and other drivers as well, all passing this recovery vehicle whilst the track was still live. Now, for those of you that haven't watched Formula One very, very long, or don't know the story, 8 years ago, we were in a very similar situation. Granted, we didn't have a safety car. Yellow flags were out, and this was the incident that really brought about the virtual safety car. The fatal crash involving Jules Bianchi that I'm talking about here. And the biggest thing that I felt that we learned from this, or at least I thought that we'd learned from this, is that recovery vehicles on a track, on a live track, safety car or not, they should not be on a track at the same time as a Formula One car. even in dry conditions. We saw this in Monza early in the year with Daniel Ricciardo, and there was a bit of a concern there, but fortunately everything was okay, even though it was dangerous. Why, oh why do we think then it's suitable for a recovery vehicle to be on a near impossible track to see it on, let alone make adjustments to avoid it? And we saw some of the other drivers under the safety car having to take evasive action. Max Verstappen almost drove off the road to make sure he gave it a wide enough berth whilst it was there. We saw a few others having to do the same thing. Pierre Gasly, much further down the track, trying to catch up the field, as he normally would do in dry conditions under the safety car, going at that sort of speed. Why did they think that it wasn't a good idea to inform him that there was a recovery vehicle on the circuit to slow down specifically in that area before he got there? They knew where he was on the circuit. They knew he was coming up to that. Why did no one at the FIA or the stewards tell AlphaTauri or even directly communicate to the driver that he should have been warned about that recovery vehicle? Because quite frankly, if he drives into that at 250 miles an hour, halo or no halo, he's dead. Yeah. I'm not even going to try and sugarcoat this.
That's it.
It's disgusting. It's unacceptable. And quite frankly, I'm lost for words at how far we're supposed to have come with safety. And yet once again, through just being completely negligent to this whole issue, the FIA right now are incredibly lucky that we did not get a repeat of what happened 8 years ago.
I think the fact that it's one thing if the vehicle was in a runoff area or, at the back of a gravel track. It was on the actual circuit. So you could have had a situation where a car could have had a slight off moment in these, wet conditions. And you're right, the drive would have been done. Game over. And you're right, it's disgusting. They've completely put all the drivers at risk. And I find it ironic how they're so sensitive about running races, make sure we don't run races when the weather's too wet for the safety of their drivers. So the rain's unsafe for the drivers, but having a tractor on the track is absolutely fine. And another thing, I saw a great tweet whilst watching the race live. It seems that the FIA seem to believe that jewellery is more dangerous than having a tractor on track. Because
it is.
It's just true. Yeah. And this is another example. For that, for me, in a nutshell, is the exact issue that we're talking about. But going back, not only is it completely disgraceful towards the drivers, it's absolutely just so disrespectful to the family and friends and the memory of George Bianchi, because he died, or he ended up having the accident which led to his untimely death at the same circuit in very similar conditions. So can you imagine how Joe Bianchi's family and friends felt seeing that reoccur? Because the only crumb of comfort that they could take from their family members' death is that maybe lessons would have been learnt from it and other lives could have been saved. We saw the introduction of the halo as an indirect consequence of it, which is fantastic. But to see the tractors on the track like that, after everything that's happened, that must be a real kick in the gut for the family. You know what? Tonight, I'm feeling so... I was about to swear. I feel so bad for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had an Instagram post from Jules' father, Philippe_Bianchi17, basically saying exactly that, Courtney. Putting a photo of Pierre Gasly's onboard from F1 TV, circling the recovery vehicle, and you can barely make it out. And if you didn't circle it, you'd have a hard time seeing this. So, fair play to Philippe for doing this. But he basically put the caption saying, "No respect for the life of the driver, no respect for Jules' memory, incredible." We had so many different people weighing in on this particular issue. We had so many drivers saying this was unacceptable. Checo Perez saying it was the lowest point that we had seen in this sport in years. What happened today just makes me so angry. I hope everyone in this sport never gets to see this situation ever again, because you're always putting the drivers at risk. We also had Who is it? We also, sorry, just scrolling through some. I've got so many tweets that I've saved and so much. This is what I was doing on the way home from Paris today, Courtney. Literally just looking at social media, finding so many different viewpoints from so many people on this subject. It was a good use of my time, I'll put it that way, as I was travelling back. Karen Shanduk for Sky F1 basically saying that the FIA should have waited until Pierre had passed the incident before releasing the recovery vehicle onto the track in these low visibility conditions. Pierre was also going at a much faster speed than anyone else, should have been warned on the radio where the vehicle was so that he could slow down appropriately. Martin Brundle basically saying the same sort of thing as Karen Chanduk, saying that there should never ever be a tractor on track until all the cars are collected up behind a safety car or in the pits. Gasly cannot take the blame for this incident. Alice Powell, W Series race driver and Sky broadcaster as well, basically saying the same thing, saying that they actually have a direct communications between the FIO, the lead race director, and the drivers for moments like these. For some reason, we don't seem to have that in Formula 1. We have the same thing in Formula E as well, where the race director can communicate with the drivers. These are the sorts of moments where something like that would actually come in handy. Why in the pinnacle of motorsport we don't have something like this, or we don't have scenarios where people actually use their heads in a live scenario? I know there's a lot of pressure on these people to make these calls in the moment, but let's be honest, quite frankly, it's just negligent, it's ridiculous, and for the cheek of the race stewards to summon Gasly after the race, give him a 20-second time penalty, which was basically equivalent of a drive-through penalty, and 2 points on his license, to suggest that he was at fault in the same way that they suggested that Jules Bianchi was at fault for that incident 8 years ago. For me, that's unacceptable. Quite frankly, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, in the random chance that you are listening to this, you really need to pull something together right now, because quite frankly, I know it's not the best start to your tenure and there's a lot of things on your plate, but quite frankly, this is unacceptable. And for me, I don't really think there's much more that I can say that hasn't been said already. I am livid. I am angry.
Yeah.
If it was me on circuit and something like that had happened, part of me would almost feel like I wouldn't want to get back in that car and race again until something was done to make sure that these sorts of things don't happen again. It's absolutely ridiculous, quite frankly.
I want to conclude by saying a couple of things. First of all, the removal of, oh, God, just had another mind blank, Michael Massey from last season. That was just the tip of the iceberg. No way was removing him gonna be the solution. That was the tip of the iceberg. Trust me, there's a lot going underneath. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, which is rotten to the core at the moment. And another thing I want to touch on, and I've said it many times before, things haven't been quite right with the stewarding since Charlie Whiting passed away. He was so fantastic at his job, and it just seems he's left a massive void. And I think it's going to take a long time for the stewarding to get up to the standards that it was when he was in charge, because I've noticed it. There's been a dramatic slip in the standard of the stewarding since Charlie Whiting passed away.
Yeah, absolutely right. I couldn't agree with him more. I'm just going to end this with two quotes. One from Pierre Gasly after the race, where he basically said, "It's disrespectful to Jules. I'm glad to be alive. I was scared to death. If I had lost the car, I wouldn't be here to answer your questions. I'm glad I can talk to my family tonight and get home safe." And just one final one from Adam Cooper F1 on Twitter. He said that he'd spoken to many drivers after the race, including the likes of George Russell, Daniel Ricciardo, Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon, and Valtteri Bottas, and others. Everyone upset by the tractor incident. The most scary thing, several of them didn't even see the crane even travelling slowly behind the safety car, an indication of just what the visibility was like. I mean, that just says it all right there. And I just found it absolutely despicable. One thing, of course, we should talk about with Pierre Gasly, and guys, get your comments but in the comments section. Let us know what your thoughts are on that incident, and to the best of your ability, let us know your thoughts towards the FIA on what they should have done and what they need to do going forward, because we were lucky today, and in certain incidents where that sort of thing happens, you cannot deny that these things are dangerous. You have to make sure that and implement certain measures so that these sort of things don't happen again, and that perhaps next time we may not be so lucky. That's what we have to take from this, quite frankly. So let me know your thoughts on that incident. With Pierre Gasly, some good news, of course, Courtney. Finally, the news has been confirmed about where he's going to be next season. Now, of course, he had a contract lined up with AlphaTauri for 2023, so he was definitely going to be on the grid, but he is swapping colours. He is joining Alpine to join Esteban Ocon next season, with Nick de Vries going to AlphaTauri in his place. So, of course, Courtney, we knew it was very likely that this was going to happen. We even had Fabrizio Romano, the famous football journalist, with the old "here we go" message that he puts out for football transfers, putting one out for Formula One. Not necessarily breaking the news, because it was something that we kind of knew, but he was the one with a bit of an inside track from the Formula One perspective. So first things first, Corny, on a more positive note, great move for Pierre Gasly, and of course as well a great move for Nick de Vries to be on the 2023 grid as well.
Yeah, I think first of all, it's going to be great for Pierre to obviously drive for a French team. He'll feel more at home. Obviously, I know they're based in the UK, but to drive for a French team, he'll feel a lot more at home. He'll probably feel we have a bit more. This would be something that he can properly work on. I think when a driver's in a Red Bull program, they're almost on tenterhooks because there's so much competition to sort of get the seats, and some of the management in and around the Red Bull Academy is questionable at times. So he's probably going to feel a lot more at ease. I'm just going to find it very interesting how it goes between him and Esteban Ocon, because look, it's well known they have a little bit of a checkered history. They seem to be okay together on the media shoot that they did, I think, on Friday. Yeah, I think it was yesterday or Friday, and they did the pictures of them together. But I think once doing that same garage together, and you start getting, if there's like a trend of one driver doing better than the other, I think there's going to be fireworks there. And you know what? I'll be honest, I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I mean, Esteban Ocon put on a Instagram post with the two of them posing in a photo together, talking, of course, about how important this is for two French drivers in a French Formula One team, how powerful that's going to be. I mean, talking to a few people in Paris, they were obviously very excited to hear about this news, and a new era of French Formula One racing. It's going to be very exciting to see how that gets on. There were some concerns in the past that we've obviously brought up about these two, whether they can lead this team going forward. Is there one leader in there between the two of them, or maybe two that will clash and perhaps one will rise to the occasion where the other one falters, as often happens in Formula One? We'll have to wait and see, but I, for one, am very excited to see this all work out. Probably the best outcome for Alpine, given what happened with Fernando Alonso and Oscar Piastri. It took a while to get there, but it looks like they've got their dream driver lined up, and hopefully for their sake, it's one that will certainly pay them back in huge dividends for years to come. Certainly one we'll have to keep an eye on. Nick de Vries, of course, we already mentioned, replacing Gasly in AlphaTauri next season. Courtney, I know we only really had one good look of Nick de Vries in a Formula One car, to which he delivered a solid P9 in the Williams, despite all the odds at the Italian Grand Prix earlier this year. Is it a surprise that AlphaTauri have taken this gamble with Nick de Vries, or do you feel that perhaps this is a driver that should have been in Formula One a few years ago at least, and it's about time that he's getting his chance?
No, it's well deserved. I thought he was going to end up going to Williams, but look, he had a great audition in Monza, last minute driving for the Williams team. But look, the lad has won the F2 championship. He's also won the Formula E championship as well. People have their opinions on Formula E, but you have to be on point every race to do well in Formula E. The races are so chaotic. So for him to not only be an F2 champion, but a Formula E champion as well, he's already shown credentials. He's already shown in Monza that he can drive an F1 car well. So I wish him the best of luck, but I think he's going to do well in F1.
Yeah, absolutely right. Just a quick note on a tweet from Andrew Benson, the BBC Sport journalist, obviously for what we were just talking about with the FIA on the Gasly incident. The FIA have announced that due to circumstances and take into account feedback from a number of drivers and also team principals as well, the FIA has launched a thorough review of the events involving deployment of recovery vehicles during the Japanese Grand Prix. I mean, that just pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? I mean, they seem quite adamant that Gasly was the reason why this incident occurred, and what they did was everything fine. Now that everyone else has weighed in on this incident, they obviously feel the need to change their mind on this, quite frankly. So it just sums it all up, doesn't it, Courtney? They just can't seem to make their mind up, or at least they make one decision one day and then You know, they seem to feel like they have everything covered off, and as soon as the drivers make comments on this, or someone actually says, actually, you know what, you're not actually doing the right thing, all of a sudden they just backtrack. So, I don't know. Honestly, do not know what to say, really.
We was talking about this before we start recording. Sometimes it seems that the people making the decisions like around this sport, it's like they won it in a competition. They won the role. They won the competition, so they was given the role, and they're just swinging it. They're just swinging it, and they're just making up the rules as they go along. They change the rules when they fancy it. And I just think today is just completely highlighted it. Look, it's been going on it's been amplified over the past couple of years, but today really was the cherry on the cake. It's been nothing short of shambolic. Like I'm glad it took us such a long time to recall straight after the race because I was livid. I don't think I would have been able to discuss these topics in a rational manner
Yeah.
if we recorded straight after the race the way we used to did. So the fact that we're recording later, sorry, it was a blessing in disguise because trust me, I was so disillusioned. I've been disillusioned. I've become growing disillusioned by the sport. We do a podcast about the sport because we love it so much. But I can't lie. Over recent weeks, months, I'm growing more and more disillusioned, and it's not because of the sport itself. It's because of the decisions that are ruining the actual enjoyment of the sport because we don't trust the decisions that have been made. So look, I'm repeating myself here. I just really hope that change comes and it comes fast.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you on that one, Courtney. It's an absolute mess. I'm going to leave you guys with one final quote before we move on and talk about the race and the thing that we actually want to talk about on these podcasts. The reason why we actually made this show to talk about Formula One racing rather than all the politics and all the ineptitude and everything else that's going on right now with the governing body and those that are meant to be here to make this sport safe and make the sport controversy free to the best of their ability rather than actually create the danger and create the controversy themselves. Basically, the quote was from the 2014 analysis of the investigation of the Jules Bianchi incident. And this is the quote that I feel that's rather relevant to sort of see how, even though we'd like to think we've come quite far, sometimes we get a stark reminder that there's still so much more that needs to be done and it has to happen now. And it's this. It is considered fundamentally wrong to try and make an impact between a racing car and a large and heavy vehicle survivable. It is therefore imperative to prevent a car ever hitting the crane and or the marshals working near it. Powerful stuff. Let's move on to the race. We did get the race underway, Corny, once again, and a lot of interesting strategy choices. We had Max Verstappen getting everything going again. The race was on a time. I think we only had about just under 40 minutes left of running because the original race started 2 and a bit hours before that. And of course, normally the races, when they get going, they need to be completed within a 3-hour window. And of course, the race clock was ongoing during that red flag. But once we got back going again, Max Verstappen leading the pack out and basically never really looked back. Of course, when they pitted for tyres to go back onto the intermediate tyres, literally almost instantly after, the only notable exception was Mick Schumacher, who was leading a Formula One Grand Prix to the shock of many, which would have been a nice experience for him. Until, of course, Max Verstappen re-overtook him to take the lead. And from then on in, Courtney, Max Verstappen was just in a league of his own, quite frankly, wasn't he?
Yeah, despite the conditions, the race itself just summed up the season. Well, particularly the last few races. Max was able to sort of run F1 in easy mode. Leclerc tried his best to keep up, but his tyres went away, which just sort of shows how Ferrari have kind of faltered and fallen away as the season has gone on, you know, to the point where Perez put enough pressure on him to eventually get past with him via the decision by the stewards. So it's another Red Bull 1-2, which shows that Red Bull are certainly been the best team this season. And then I think behind that we got some. I think the best battles we kind of got were between Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso, and the fact that we saw two of the drivers that our generation are sort of used to seeing, it kind of gave me a nostalgic moment because we've seen so many great battles between Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel. It was great to see it happen one more time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're definitely going to talk about that in a bit. one point you did make that I did want to sort of draw on a little bit more was how surprising it was to see the Ferraris. Now, we know that the Ferraris chew up their tyres ever since this new technical directive came into place. They've chewed up their tyres so much more, particularly at the front in dry conditions. What was really surprising was how badly the Ferrari degraded its tyres in wet conditions. It was crazy. I mean, did you see, Courtney? There was, I think it was Gianluca Delle Alessandro on his Twitter page, showed in side-by-side comparison photos between Charles Leclerc's Ferrari, the front tyres, and Max Verstappen's. Max Verstappen's looked in great shape. It must be said, he really is becoming a tyre whisperer in Formula One, the likes of which we see from Sir Lewis Hamilton or Sergio Perez, actually. How good Max has become at looking after those tyres. They look in great shape. Charles Leclerc's, they were almost turning into slicks. And that would have been really dangerous. I think we had one radio message during the race where Charles was really struggling to hold on to his tyres and keep up with Max. He was even asking what to do if they had to pit. Where would they come out? And he said they'd lose 5 positions. So he had to hold on to his tyres. Of course, making that mistake going through the final chicane, gaining an advantage where the stewards deemed penalty worthy, despite the fact that they didn't need to investigate that after the race and ask his feedback and all the other stuff. They just seemed to make the decision when it suited them after the race. Fair penalty, but, you know, semantics and all of that. But the tyres were in really bad shape. And Mattia Binotto kind of alluded onto this because he was aware of these issues. He's not blaming the new technical directive that came in, although there is an apparent difference between the car before that and the car afterwards. And this seems to be the defining factor that we're getting from this. He was under the impression that Charles Leclerc actually chewed up his tyres quite early on in the stint, and that if he'd have managed the tyres a bit better, he would have been able to be much more comfortable. I'm not really sure that that's right, though, because I'm not going to come out here and say that I know more about Formula One tyres and how a Ferrari behaves than Mattia Binotto does. But we've seen this race by race by race, and I'd like to think Charles Leclerc is pretty handy at managing tyres, or at least managing the pace on tyres to a degree where not many other people could do the same thing that he could do with the machinery that he has. But we had radio messages saying that the crew were quite happy with how Charles was managing his tyre life, and yet the tyres were still degrading at such a bad race. So there's a fundamental issue with this Ferrari that they really need to get on top with for 2023. And it's quite evident that Mattia Binotto was not there this weekend. He was more interested in overseeing the work on the 2023 car. Above anything else, Courtney, if Ferrari are going to stake a championship challenge in 2023, and personally I really, really hope that they can, is how they manage the tyres going to be critical to get right in order to maintain any sort of a challenge for them?
Well, yeah, because it's a fundamental thing you need to get right in order to do well in F1 races. You know, if people are new to F1 and think, "Oh, why is there so much talk about tyres?" Trust me, the characteristics of a tyre can make or break a race in seconds. So for Ferrari, they know what they need to do. I do think that it's going to be difficult for Ferrari and Mercedes to close the gap to Red Bull. They've really seemed to have got these 2022 regulations right. And going into next season, I'm expecting more of a battle between Mercedes and Ferrari, and Red Bull still leading at the front. So yeah, Ferrari are really going to have to understand what exactly has pegged them back with this new technical directive, and then maybe find some solutions from there. But I don't think they're going to find a solution overnight.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, Mattia Binotto was talking about this, and he was saying that the flaw was as expected, and it's their last upgrade that really has caused these problems. And they have to look at these things and how the changes to the flaw have complied with the new technical directive. He didn't say that that impacted their performance. It was rather they were penalised by Red Bull's development. Not quite sure how Red Bull's development kind of affects the Ferrari, so to speak. Especially, not only because of the fact that the Ferrari seems to have had these issues since the summer break, but more to the point that that car has fallen back towards Mercedes' pace rather than what Red Bull are doing right now. It's a very, very strange thing, and it seems to be coming again from the line of excuses that Mattia Binotto seems to come out with to deny that there's an issue going on with Ferrari right now. It's not really healthy. And, from a fan's perspective, really, if you're going to make those excuses, then you kind of need to be at the circuit to kind of explain this in a bit more detail rather than be at the factory. I know he's doing what he needs to do, but right now it seems to be once again that he's not really owning up and saying, look, this is just not working for us. We need to come and do better in the same way that Toto Wolff does or Christian Horner does. Just say it as it is. If you're going to make up excuses and the same patterns keep repeating themselves, the only change that's going to be made is the one at the helm, really, because quite frankly, you need someone that's going to give answers to these issues, to acknowledge where the problems are, rather than say that everyone else is causing these issues when that's not actually happening.
No, you're right. I think that he's trying to be a good leader and trying to protect people in the team that have, made errors along the way. But I'd be really intrigued to know as a casual fan exactly what has led to Ferrari's downfall. Look, we've made the jokes about the high-profile mistakes they made throughout the season, but we always said, like particularly with qualifying in the first half of the season, the car itself is good. The fundamentals of the car, it's good, but they fell behind, and we don't know how our Red Bull's R&D project went this season, but it just seemed that at one point, I remember like Austria in particular. I remember Austria how Ferrari won that race because they were able to manage the tyres a lot more better than the Red Bull, and that was Austria. That wasn't far from the summer break. And then from Spa onwards, they just fell back. So it'd just be interesting to know in the actual reasons that have led to Ferrari falling back. We reckon it's a technical directive, but it'd be interesting to know the actual reasons for it.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, one thing that we have heard a lot about with the Red Bull in recent weeks is this new little trick that they have where they can use the suspension to lower the car closer to the floor when it's going in a straight line, but it manages to maintain the downforce levels as well in the corners as well, which, I mean, it's a very, very good trick. It's something similar to what Mercedes used to use with DAS and their suspension stuff at the rear as well. Not suggesting that it is the same thing for those of you thinking, oh, the FIA need to get on top of that and rule that out as well. Very clever innovations going on elsewhere. Ferrari really looking for answers more than anything else. I mean, from a season which has had some highlights, but ultimately over the course of the season has proven to be rather erratic and unfortunately a bit of a blunder, for lack of a better way of putting it. I think it was, I was looking on Twitter again, Connie. This is where I get all my information from, so you can tell how reliable and credible I am as a secondary source of information. We had Aldas, a friend of the show, on his Twitter, basically summing this up perfectly, saying that Leclerc in a Ferrari choking the final corner to hand Max and Red Bull the World Championship after a 5-second penalty, post-race penalty. There's a metaphor for the 2022 season somewhere in there, and quite frankly, I think he's spot on. I can't think of a better way of putting it. As this season has gone on, despite Red Bull's brilliance, it's time and time again where Ferrari trip over themselves or suffer the consequences of their own shortcomings and of being the architects of their own downfall for one way or another this season. And it's something that Ferrari will have to get on top on for next season if they are going to stake themselves a serious championship claim, one more serious than we were hoping that they actually delivered this season. It promised so much after the opening few races. It really did. Who would have thought after the Australian Grand Prix that Max Verstappen would have won the championship with 4 races left to go, with Charles Leclerc seemingly having the championship in his grasp? And we admittedly said that it did seem his to lose. How wrong we were at the time. The good news for Ferrari, we should mention though, Courtney, is that despite the penalty for Charles and the retirement for Carlos Sainz, they did outscore Mercedes. 1 point, but they did outscore Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship. So I suppose at the very least, they will be safe in the knowledge knowing that Mercedes didn't gain any ground on them this weekend.
Yeah, with Mercedes, it seems they've completely given up on the 2022 cars. It's certainly been a season to forget for Mercedes. I think Ferrari, there'll be a sense of relief, because if Mercedes were to finish ahead of Ferrari after all the well-known difficulties that Mercedes have had this season, it would be truly embarrassing for Ferrari. So I think you're right. I think it'd be more of a sense of relief than anything that they've come away from a bad weekend still sort of having a healthy gap over Mercedes.
Yeah, very, very true. I mean, the Mercedes, admittedly, this weekend, it was a bit of a surprise. This was a circuit we thought maybe they might be quite decent, but then the car is a bit draggy, so we'd have to see how that sort of plays out. It didn't look fast on the straights. It certainly didn't look fast in the corners. It wasn't a handful, but it just didn't look fast, really, which was quite a surprise, actually. A bit disappointing. The wet weather we thought might come to Mercedes' aid. Ultimately, it didn't. They were still quite a way off the pace of the leaders. We had a nice battle between Esteban Ocon and Sir Lewis Hamilton, particularly that moment in 130R where they almost go wheel to wheel whilst they're overtaking Mick Schumacher, was quite fun to see. Esteban Ocon doing a great job to defend and ultimately managing to keep the 7-time Formula 1 world champion at bay, which is very, very impressive. If the race had gone full distance like we hoped it would have done, maybe Sir Lewis would have gotten his man, but no, great performance from Esteban. Great battle between those two, hopefully many more to come. George Russell, despite a difficult qualifying session where he didn't get through to Q3, which was quite the shock, he managed to find his way back into the top 10, finishing in P8 today. Had a nice few little battles as he was going around, so done rather well, but overall, for Mercedes, not the best weekend. Probably one that they will probably put back in the memory bank and think they'll learn from it. And as you said, Corny, the focus does seem to be for next season, but I'm sure Mercedes will keep fighting in this championship for P2 in the Constructors at the very, very least.
I still think they'll be aiming to put themselves in the mix for a win. I think they'll be very keen to get a win under their belts. But yeah, next season, they seem to be confident that they found the solutions to this year's problems. But at the same time, the likes of Red Bull and Ferrari aren't standing still either. So it's a very, very big winter for Mercedes. And again, there are a few unanswered questions with regards to why certain teams are where they are in the pecking order. I'm not going to go there again. But once we get answers this week, the teams have all got the facts and they just need to start finding answers to their own flaws. Because we want to be seeing a competitive 2023 season. The season promised so much and it turned out to be an anticlimax.
Yeah, very, very true with Mercedes. And obviously we're getting towards the end of the season now, and you know we all thought Mercedes would probably win a Grand Prix at some point in the season and return to the front. We just wasn't sure when it was going to happen. They haven't quite managed it yet, so perhaps with a view to it happening in 2023, or depending on what happens with this budget cap business that of course we're going to be talking about when that's unleashed tomorrow. It's rather it's one that you kind of have to ponder right now, because we've got the Mexican Grand Prix coming up. We've got the US Grand Prix coming up. That's going to be in a couple of weeks' time. Then we've got the Brazilian Grand Prix, which is going to involve a sprint race, of course, one where Mercedes were so dominant last season, and the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. 4 tracks with different characteristics for different reasons, some that could suit Mercedes a bit more than others. Out of any of those, Corny, which one do you think presents the best opportunity for Mercedes to get a Grand Prix victory? And of those, how likely do you think it is to happen?
Out of all the tracks you've mentioned, probably Austin, because Austin is a circuit that's traditionally suited the Mercedes. I would have said Abu Dhabi because, you know, Mercedes this season have probably been a bit better in the sort of the street circuit style, and I think Sector 2 in particular as street circuit style specifics to it. But one of the biggest flaws in the Mercedes this season is that they struggle to warm up the tyres. So the fact it's a night race in Abu Dhabi, obviously Abu Dhabi's hot, but the fact it's in the night, it's a night race. Mercedes are reliant on there being hot temperatures in order to be close to competing. So that's what they're going to need. Maybe Mexico, because we always saw in Mexico that Mercedes engine performance would fall away because of the altitude of the Mexican circuit. Maybe this will pull Red Bull back into range of Ferrari and Mercedes. So that could be an interesting one.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think Mexico is probably going to present the best opportunity for Mercedes for the remainder of the season. We often talk about Mercedes being a car that's very, very draggy, and it's one that's struggled in that regard. And of course, a lot of people that know the Mexican Grand Prix circuit are obviously going to come back at us and say, well, what about that long straight? Well, that is the thing. You know, the long straight normally would be a nightmare for the Mercedes W13, but because it's such a high altitude, the drag coefficient is obviously not going to be as powerful. That could be an opportunity for Mercedes where they may feel that could be a track where their weaknesses are diminished and mitigated to a degree, and they can use that to set them up on a street circuit style and be quite strong there. So we'll have to wait and see. Of course, the Red Bull is going to be very strong there. The Ferrari is also going to be very strong there. That's another somewhat draggy car, not as draggy as the W13. Ferrari might fancy their chances of that circuit as well for a Grand Prix victory. So I think that's one that I think Mercedes will be looking at for the remainder of the season. I think that is the one that we could actually get a result. So we'll have to wait and see, but we are getting perilously close to the end of the season, one where Mercedes may not win a Grand Prix, and of course Sir Lewis Hamilton still needs to get a win to preserve that record that he has so famously of winning a Grand Prix in every single season of his F1 career now. Only 4 more races to go, Corny, and the clock is very much ticking on that one. It would be a shame for it to come to an end this year, despite everything that's gone on.
No, first of all, like you're right. I think it'd just be very sort of apt for Mercedes that have dominated for such a long time, and Lewis that has won so many Grand Prix throughout the season. For both of those to go without wins would be quite telling. The reason why I started laughing is because I think that's why you got a smile on your face as well. We literally just got a message from Lee on our group chat. He's only just watched the race, and I think his reaction sums up really. It was
WTF.
Yeah, just watch the race. WTF.
Yeah.
I think that sums it up, doesn't it? That really sums it up.
It really does. It really does. But but let us know your thoughts, guys. Are Mercedes going to win a Grand Prix in 2022? Who is going to win it if you think that they are? And where are they going to win it? Or if you don't feel that they're going to win, out of curiosity, which track do you think presents the most likely venue for a Mercedes victory? Courtney and I are going with Mexico. For reasons we've just explained. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And of course, if you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Of course, we're chasing 1,000 subscribers. Got to get that in at some point. Help us out if you can. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcasting platform, you can support us by giving us a 5-star review. And we will read out any 5-star reviews that you give us on Apple iTunes podcasts in the next episode. Let's move on now, Courtney, to the battle with Alpine and McLaren. Now, Alpine started the day 4 points behind McLaren, I believe it was. They've now overtaken McLaren. I'm just literally scrolling over as I speak. There we go. Yeah, 4 points behind McLaren at the start of the day. End of the day, 13 points ahead. Now, there was a big shift in momentum between the two teams at the Singapore Grand Prix, where McLaren had a fantastic weekend and Alpine had a dismal weekend. Role reversal this time at Suzuka, with Lando Norris finishing in the top 10 with Ricciardo in 11th, Esteban Ocon in P4, and Fernando Alonso narrowly missing out on P6 after what you mentioned earlier, Courtney, was a titanic race-long battle with Sebastian Vettel, which ultimately ended with the two of them separated by 11 thousandths of a second. We didn't see this on the TV coverage, so another failing of the broadcasting team on this one, because they were too busy looking at replays that none of us were really interested in. We wanted to see that grandstand finish. Sebastian Vettel just pipping Fernando over the line in a last lap dash. Brilliant stuff to see between those two, really rolling back the years. With this being said, Vettel's final Japanese Grand Prix, very emotional one for him, being the venue where he won his second World Championship in 2011 for the Red Bull team. But Alpine, Courtney, Ocon 4th, Alonso 7th, with full points awarded as well, which ultimately gave him an even larger advantage over McLaren this weekend. This was the perfect way for them to respond after a difficult Singapore Grand Prix.
No, absolutely. I think, we said this when we discussed the Alpine McLaren battle before. Alpine have two drivers that are doing a job for them. Esteban Ocon, probably his best performance of the season. And Fernando Alonso, we always know that he's going to be getting the results for the team when the car's actually working. So for me, the performance from the drivers of both teams today has summed up the season as a whole. Daniel Ricciardo didn't actually have a bad weekend, generally speaking, but I just think in terms of pure pace, McLaren, Alpine were the better team. But we've always said this, that throughout the course of the season, the Alpine seems to work on more circuits compared to McLaren. It seems to be, I think McLaren seems to have the ultimate pace, but Alpine have it more consistently. And I think this is why the two things are probably going to win Alpine this mini battle. One, both drivers are on it, and two, the Alpines are just more consistent than the McLaren.
Yeah, and we were expecting Alpine to have the upper hand on McLaren this weekend. I mean, we saw the qualifying pace. Ocon, Alonso 5th and 7th in qualifying. Really, really good stuff. They got right in there with the Mercedes. Their pace really went up this weekend. They usually are quick everywhere, to quite frankly. As you said, Connie, they really are the plug-and-play team this season, with the exception, of course, of Red Bull, perhaps as a comparison. Alpine are just brilliantly consistent everywhere. McLaren, this was always going to be one of the more difficult weekends. Norris just about getting in the top 10, although he was half a second off the next fastest car, which was Sebastian Vettel in the Aston Martin. What an effort he put in this weekend, which we'll talk about in a bit. Ricciardo also failing to get through to Q3. His pace, he was closer to his teammate this weekend, it must be said. It was one of those weekends that he was definitely closer, but ultimately not quite close enough, not getting into points, which was obviously going to be critical for McLaren this season on a weekend where driver moves are now being announced left, right and centre, and more doors seem to be closing on Daniel Ricciardo's F1 career, at least for next season, where admittedly himself was quoted in saying that he thinks the reality is now that he will not be on the grid in 2023 and he's looking at options for 2024. And, you know, this is something we've expected for a while, Courtney, but hearing those words from Daniel himself, the fact that he seems like he's lost belief now that he's going to be on the grid for next season, that is very much a hefty blow to take, not just for himself, but for his legions of Formula One fans out there across the world.
Yeah, I think in terms of what he offers the sport, or the entertainment factor, he is a real asset. He really is a true asset to the sport. And if he's not around next season, he will be missed. And I really do hope we get to see him again. But I think the Daniel Ricciardo situation just shows how lethal and how unforgiving the F1 world is. It just shows how you have to be careful which decisions you make. Fernando Alonso's career is another example of that. You got to be careful, which teams you stay with when you choose to move, which teams you go to, because it can define your career. He had a steady seat at Alpine. I reckon he would have continued to do so, but obviously he wanted to have a new challenge at McLaren. And that decision has ultimately led to him going out of the F1 trapdoor. And it's sad to see.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I mean, wasn't it Cyril Abiteboul, former Renault team principal and Alpine team principal briefly, in Drive to Survive, that quote that gets thrown around following Ricciardo's move to McLaren from the Renault team a few years ago, him quoted as saying that he thinks strongly that he will live to regret this, and it seems that has come to fruition, quite frankly. We never thought it would happen, that Ricciardo would fall to the wayside in such a way this season at McLaren. We all kind of expected this McLaren experiment to work. Unfortunately, for so many different reasons, we may never know the full extent of the truth as to how this has happened, but unfortunately, it does seem to be coming to an end. We just hope, sincerely, that this is not the end of Ricciardo's story in Formula One. We hope there are other chapters to come, but it looks like we may have to wait at least a year for an opportunity to present itself, and maybe that's what it needs, just a bit of time away for him to reflect, spend time with his family, do some other racing if he wants to, be a reserve driver somewhere, be a supporting act, kind of stick around, hopefully something will come up. The guy is incredibly talented. I'm certainly sure he's got plenty more pace to offer. We just need to hope that an opportunity will come for him in the future. So hopefully for Daniel that will happen. We'll have to wait and see how that works out. We should move on now to Sebastian Vettel, the driver of the day. In many people's eyes, think thoroughly well-deserved, recovering after a difficult start where he got tagged by Fernando Alonso, and quite frankly, you can't really blame either driver in that incident, really, Courtney. The stewards certainly didn't feel that way. Hardly able to see, no visibility whatsoever. Vettel really living on his instincts, and ultimately instincts can only get you so far in Formula One, but able to recover after that incident to get all the way back up to P6, finishing narrowly ahead of Fernando in an exciting battle between the former world champions. It was great stuff to see Sebastian getting some big points for Aston Martin, now bringing them ever so closer to Alfa Romeo, stretching further ahead of Haas and AlphaTauri. 7 points now the gap between Alfa Romeo and Aston Martin after Vettel getting a hefty 8 points for the team. Surely right now, it feels that Aston Martin could very much pip Alfa Romeo to the post for P6 in the championship. After the struggles they had at the start of the season, Courtney, P6 sounds pretty good if you're in the Aston Martin camp. They really have managed to recover quite the pace from this car in the latter half of the season.
I was going to say, I think they will. I think they will finish sixth because they've shown like a late resurgence. I've been very vocal about the likes of Alfa Romeo and Haas kind of stagnating as the season has gone on, whereas Aston Martin have done the opposite. I'm sure it'll raise some eyebrows given that Aston Martin are one of the teams that are rumoured to have breached the cost cap rules. I'm sure there'll be raised eyebrows about that. But yeah, they've certainly made a late resurgence. And yeah, as much of a shame it is that Sebastian Vettel's going to be leaving. When it was announced, I said, I hope he gets at least one more moment for him to enjoy and showcase what he's capable of to this very day. And he was able to do that, in a race which was as chaotic as it was in Suzuka, a circuit that he loved, racing against an old rival. I think today will give him memories that he will cherish for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a shame, there has such an emotional tie to Suzuka, and it was such a shame for him that this is the last time that we're going to see him. I was hearing rumours the other day that Sebastian Vettel was actually looking at potentially reconsidering retiring from Formula One. He was putting the feelers out last minute to try and see if there are options. May have had some ties or some truth in it with what was going on potentially with Alpine, So, it's a shame that Seb is feeling that way. Unfortunately, it's too little too late, really. I'm sure there would have been an opportunity for him if he didn't want to retire, but that's how things go in Formula One, quite honestly. So maybe Vettel still has the racing bug there. He still has something he wants to do. Not quite sure it's going to be at Formula One in the same way that Ricciardo is looking. Not that there's much of an age difference between the two, amazingly. It wasn't so long ago that Sebastian Vettel was a 4-time world champion and Daniel Ricciardo was the up-and-coming star that was about to usurp his throne within the team, quite frankly. It just seems such a long time ago. Really, really hits you right in the feels, that one, for nostalgia purposes. Lance Stroll as well, obviously, was a bit unlucky not to get points today. Did you see the footage of his start, Courtney? I don't know if you saw a replay, but watch it back, guys. If you get a chance, watch Lance Stroll's start for the Japanese Grand Prix. It was a real thriller. It really was. He got such a great launch, knew absolutely no fear, and threw that car into turn one. Done so well not to get tagged. But no, great stuff to see from Lance Stroll. Just unlucky not to get some points, but ultimately a good day for Aston Martin. And Stroll has been there or thereabouts as well. So in these difficult conditions, he surprisingly is one of those guys you can rely on to actually give some pace and get a good result most of the time.
Again, it sums up where Aston Martin are. It seems that both of the drivers are a lot more comfortable with the car. And yeah, I think Aston Martin are certainly a team to watch in these last few races. You know what? The World Championship's wrapped up, but the Alpine McLaren battle and seeing what Aston Martin can do are certainly things that will keep us entertained for the last few races.
Yeah, absolutely right. And if Stroll could have improved his qualifying performance, starting in P19, who knows where he could have ended up in the race today. But I guess we'll never know, really. We'll just have to move on from that one. Let's talk about Alfa Romeo as well on this one. Bottas and Zhou. It's another weekend where, this time Bottas got the upper hand on Zhou. Zhou obviously had a spin at the hairpin earlier on in the race when it was very, very difficult. But the pace is just not there for them, is it, right now? There is a worry that Alfa Romeo are going to drop behind Aston Martin this Constructors' Championship. They're just hoping and praying that Aston can't get some decent points or they won't be able to score enough. But the way things are going, Courtney, I can only see Aston Martin finishing above them right now.
It looks like Aston Martin have got the performance, and it also looks like they've got the momentum and the drive to get this sixth place. For me, it seems that Alfa Romeo and Haas are effectively on the beach. They're already ready to have their holiday and go again next season. Whereas I think where Aston Martin have sort of lofty ambitions going in the future, they are going to use some of that energy to push on for these last few races. And I think Alfa Romeo just turn up, do the job, and go home. Whereas Aston Martin are more interested in getting optimum results.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that one. It's a better qualifying car, although Sebastian Vettel put in a stellar job to get into Q3 this weekend. But again, Suzuka is definitely one of his better circuits, so it's not a surprise, really. That motivation, that fire really, really lit something in him this weekend, and it showed for all the world to see. It was absolutely fantastic. But Alfa Romeo, they're just not very, very fast at the moment. They're a middle-of-the-road Q2 team at the moment, but in the race, they just seem to fall further back. Haas, another team with this issue, and it's an interesting one with Kevin Magnuson and Mick Schumacher, because whilst K-Mag right now has the seat for the next couple of years, Mick Schumacher very much fighting for his F1 career. But this is the thing with Mick Schumacher, and I'm intrigued to get your thoughts on this one in the comment section. For you guys listening to this show, I'm intrigued to get your thoughts on this one as well, Courtney. Mick Schumacher, the conundrum with him right now is that whilst he is showing some pace and he is improving, granted this was a circuit where he's never actually raced before. He was one of the few rookies this weekend, along with Zhou Guanyu and also Yuki Sonoda, to name a few, that hadn't raced at Suzuka. But Mick Schumacher has shown on quite a few, multiple occasions actually this season, and more so recently, that he actually does have, at the very least, the pace to be on par with Kevin Magnuson. Sometimes he's faster than K-Mag. But what we also saw with Mick Schumacher this weekend was the crashes. Something that has been a hallmark of his this season, and also in the past as well, where it didn't really matter for him. And this is the problem. We've seen other drivers, even at Haas, Romain Grosjean, for example, used to have this same problem. Was very, very quick on his best days, but ultimately had too many crashes. Now, we often joked about that with Romain Grosjean. You know, it was one of those things that even Gunther Steiner went as far as saying that in a car reveal, saying, oh, hopefully, Romain, you won't crash this one as much, and everyone was joking around. With Mick Schumacher, whilst he's doing the same thing that Romain was doing this in a pre-cost cap era. Now, whilst Haas are not worried so much about meeting the cost cap, they're a team that can't afford to waste unnecessary finances trying to fix the car or repair it every time Mick Schumacher makes a mistake and has a crash. And that is where lies the problem. I don't think Haas's problem with Mick Schumacher is whether or not he's fast enough to drive for this team. I think it's more down to the fact is, can they afford for him to keep crashing the car again and again and again? Right now, I'm not sure that they're convinced that is the case. Why his seat is actually on the line when you'd think, if it was down to pace alone, it shouldn't be a question. Is he a faster driver in these modern day cars than Nico Hülkenberg? Probably. But Nico Hülkenberg's the sort of driver more often than not, he's going to bring that car home in one piece, or at the very, very least, the repair bill is going to be minimal, whereas Mick Schumacher's, as we saw again this weekend, is quite a hefty one. I mean, Tree, to get your thoughts on that, Courtney.
Yep. I think you summed it up there. So the problem isn't the fact that Mick Schumacher is or isn't good enough to drive an F1 car. It's the fact that the very driver being linked with his seat is famously reliable. You know, Mr. Hulkenbach jumps in any old car, does the job, gets a maximum result for the team. And that's exactly what Haas are looking for. And you're right, like, Mick's been driving a hell of a lot faster lately, but he's still making those errors that are costly for the team and potentially the seat, because you know what you're getting with Hulkenberg. You know what you're getting. With Hulkenberg, he's what he says on the tin. And that's exactly what Haas need right now. So I feel that Mick's running out of time. We could be wrong, but they might make an announcement tomorrow saying that he's going to stay now, because it seems to happen a lot on this podcast. But it's the fact that it's Hulkenberg of all drivers that have been linked with the seat, which makes the situation so difficult for Mick Schumacher.
Yeah, very much so. I'm intrigued to get your thoughts in the comments, guys. Let me know what your thoughts on this one with Mick Schumacher. And also, let me know if you think he's going to be with the Haas team next season. It does feel right now, if Mick is going to be on the grid next season, is going to be with Haas. It's either look like it's going to be him or Nico Hülkenberg. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. We'll talk briefly about Yuki Sonoda, because we haven't really spoken about Yuki this weekend. It's his home race, emotional Grand Prix for him. And overall, I don't think he did a bad job, quite frankly. I mean, he obviously, for obvious reasons, he was finishing ahead of his teammate this weekend. But it wasn't too far off the points in the end, but not a bad job for Yuki Sonoda. But ultimately, no points for him this weekend, which is something he would have loved to have achieved at his home circuit.
He would have loved it, but you can only perform to the level of your car. And his finishing position is exactly where the AlphaTauri is this season. That the AlphaTauri is another team that has fallen away as the season has gone on. So, on one hand, yeah, I'm sure he would like to have got the headline performance in front of his own fans. But as I said, that's exactly where AlphaTauri are right now. So he can't be too harsh with himself.
No, absolutely. Let's sign off this episode talking about Williams. Now, we talked about Alex Albon, who'd be very, very downhearted, unfortunate not to finish a Grand Prix. Only lasted a lap after that earlier incident where his car just practically broke down on him, so there's not much you could do about that. But what a performance from the Goatifi himself. I wasn't following his race that much, to be honest. I did see snippets at times, but I had to rub my eyes together and double take, really. Where did Nicholas Latifi pop up finishing in P9 today? Where did that come from? He was at the back of the field, took the opportunity with the safety car, got himself up the field, held it all together, finishing in P9, no less. What a drive from Nicholas Latifi.
Do you know how I'd describe that performance from Latifi today? That was a parting middle finger to all his doubters, including us on the DNF1 podcast. So I bet when he got that result, is there sticking his middle finger out saying, "Yeah, I listen to your podcast regularly, lads. I don't appreciate how much you make fun of me." And but it was though, like, because even in the when was it? Was it? I think it was Friday practice where he made the wrong turn into the slip road rather than the final chicane, and he became he became a meme again on Friday, and everyone's laughing at him, and then he just comes out of nowhere and he goes, "Yeah, you know what? I'm leaving, but I'm going to leave you with this final parting gift." So you know what? He obviously be gutted that he's going. He knows deep down he hasn't done good enough throughout his time, but I think that was a little confidence booster for him before he leaves.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, who's to say that, I'm not going to try and rain on his parade, but who's to say he didn't pull that off again in the race? Because that was quite hilarious on Friday, where he tried to take the excursion and saying it was the car that was turning, like, what's going on with this car? And I'm thinking, I think you're fine, mate. The GPS is not working on it because you seem to be trying to take a different route. Granted, he was also a rookie at this circuit this weekend. He was one of the few drivers that had never driven at Suzuka before. Maybe he pulled that stunt off during the race and it wasn't picked up by the cameras and ended up P9. That's how he made up 11 places. I mean, probably not. Obviously, I'm not going to, mud him like that. But no, fair play to Nicholas Latifi. Really, really happy for the guy. Great job. Brilliant performance. To come from the laughing stock on Friday to getting lost on the circuit in the same way Kimi did in the Lotus several years ago at Brazil. Putting that behind him wasn't the best qualifying. Doing a great job in the difficult conditions to get the points for Williams. Fair play to the man. Absolutely stellar job. Arguably one of the drivers of the day as well. Cannot be understated. So brilliant stuff from him. But I think that's pretty much all we've got time for in this episode, Courtney. Of course, in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the outcome from the budget cap compliances. We hope to be. I mean, we don't know with the FIA. For all we know, this could be delayed even longer. But hopefully in the next episode, because there's no race next weekend, we've got a couple of weeks break now before the US Grand Prix, I believe. Mm-hmm. We now have the Formula 1 world champion in Max Verstappen. That's all been confirmed despite all the crazy stuff that's been going on with the FIA. But let us know your thoughts on that one, guys, in the comment section. And, of course, your thoughts on everything else that we've talked about in this episode. There's a lot to get through, so we really appreciate you guys sticking around with us on your Monday morning commute or however you choose to listen to this podcast. But don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And, of course, if you're listening to us on your favourite podcasting platform, do not forget to leave us a review. Hopefully it's worth 5 stars to you. If it is, fantastic. That allows us to get out to many more listeners out there that have not heard of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And of course, if you do give us a 5-star review, we will give you a shout out on the next episode as our way of saying thank you. But until next time, guys, please stay safe. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
See you soon.